there was one or two more questions related to
I
stuffing.
just want to know if you're going to address the correlation between charge temp and drop temp, and if you play with that at all, or if you just rely on gas pressure dynamics for
Okay,
reaching
so
a certain drop temp.
so the question has to do with whether you correlate the beginning and the end temperature of a roast, right? So not really, in the sense that it does make sense. It makes sense intuitively to charge hotter for a darker roast. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do it at all, but I would say that there's one of the sort of interesting limits to your choice of charge temperature is that if you charge too hot, and I don't understand this, but if you charge too hot, you're more likely to have an ROR crash later. So I don't know what too hot is on your machine. I'm not trying to prescribe a certain number or anything like that. So I'm pretty cautious about charge temperatures, about keeping them modest, like high but not crazy high. And let's say you have some customer. Everybody's got that one customer who wants some stupid dark roast, and you're like, fine, I'll do it. Resist the temptation to just charge 40 degrees hotter Fahrenheit for that coffee, because it's probably going to make it harder to have a good curve. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm talking about more like, say, 385 versus 395, and then adjusting gas in there to try to get a little bit more development at one point in your curve, or maybe a little more energy going into first crack. I mean, it's nuanced. I'm just wondering if you're going to talk to that at all.
So you're talking about, again, like different charge temperatures for different darkness of roast?
Different intent, sure, but also how fast you get there and with how much energy you go into first crack.
Okay. So that's too much in the sense that I think you're trying to address too many moving parts at once.
Okay.
So I would put it like this. We're human, right? Like there's a limited amount of considerations you can juggle before it gets so complex that you end up having more problems. Okay, so I'm going to go back to what I said before about if you choose one batch size. So this is the optimal way to roast for quality, right? And I understand that business needs may force you to compromise. Okay, but let's say you've got a 12 kilo roaster, and let's say you decide you just care about quality and nothing else. Okay, I would say pick a batch size. So let's say you pick 15 pounds or 7 kilos or something like that. Always use that batch size. Never change it, because now that allows you to have one between batch protocol and never have to go through that transition, because if you do some 15-pound batches and some 20-pound batches, everybody knows that transition from the 15 to the 20 or from the 20 to 15 is a nightmare. Like that first batch of the different batch size is not going to go well. You have to be very skillful or very lucky to make it go well, right? That to me is like a huge problem in roasting, is that people keep changing batch sizes throughout a roast day, and every time they switch batch sizes, the machine's thermal energy is off and nothing goes well. So there's a huge trade-off, right? So I'm kind of avoiding your question a little bit in order to say the optimal system is protocol for that batch size, and then pick a charge temperature, and then pick an initial gas setting based on the coffee. Okay, so because I think of it like this. This is oversimplified, but I think this will make sense. Think of your between batch protocol and your charge temperature as machine management. Think of your gas settings as bean management. Okay, so if you've got a decaf and an Ethiopian and then a Sumatra, and they're all 15-pound batches, you could conceivably use the same between batch protocol for all of them, but just use much lower gas settings for the decaf, slightly higher for the Ethiopian, and much higher for the Sumatra, on average, and be happy with the idea that, like, okay, I have a 15-pound system for between batch protocol and charge temperature, and then I'm just adjusting the gas setting. Because if you start changing your between batch protocol and your charge temperature and your gas for all different coffees and all the different batch sizes, you're going to get lost, and something's going to be suboptimal. So I hope that's close enough to an answer. Yes?
I have a question about conductive versus convective heat.
Okay.
So you're saying use less conductive heat if you can. At what point during the roast can you tell when you should be switching over to convection?
Okay, so the question is about conduction and convection. There isn't really a way to switch between the two. Okay, so like I'm not a physicist. I don't necessarily know the answer, but I know that some probot engineers have quoted to me that they see their machines as more or less imposing 70% convection, 30% conduction on average. It's probably a good estimate, right? There's no way to switch between the two. I mean, if you decrease your airflow dramatically, probably you've increased the proportion of conduction by several percent, but that's about it. Do you have an idea of how you would switch between the two? Like,
I was wondering, like airflow and like heat settings. Like if you drop the heat and then
Okay, so if you decided to lower your gas and raise your airflow a lot or something like that, like lowering the gas would lower both the conduction and the convection. Raising the airflow would very temporarily increase the convection, but the extra airflow is also going to suck heat out of the system faster. So, like, separately, like anytime you raise the airflow in the middle of a roast, what you see is your ROR either stops going down as fast or it gets a little bit of a hump, and then it'll actually fade a little faster after that because you have less heat kind of stored in the system. Okay.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
How would I control more for the convection side? So if I wanted to use more convection during my roast and not conduction, how
Okay.
would I aim to do that?
Okay, so I'm just going to repeat it because I'm not sure if you're loud enough for the camera. The question is, how do you control convection, conduction? How do you get more convection? More or less, the short answer is things we're talking about here are designed to give you relatively good ratio of convection to conduction, right? Like keeping your charge temperature reasonable. When we talk about between batch protocol, we're going to be talking about how to cool the drum between batches effectively, and we're looking at reasonable drum RPM. All these things are hopefully going to give you a slight advantage in terms of convection versus conduction.
Okay.
So yeah, hopefully that's good enough for now. I mean, there's no switch, conduction, convection. Like this is all like a system designed to sort of give you the best chance to get a good result.
Thank you.
To follow up your question, could you possibly increase your RPM on your drum speed to get more convection?
Why would it give you more
While
convection?
you're roasting? Is that
So
the way to-
when we had the drum RPM recommendations, they were designed to give you as little conduction as possible. So I don't want you to think of raising RPM as increasing convection, because hopefully you're in the happy medium. You have that 12 kilo roaster sitting at 54 RPM. Like that, those numbers are designed to give you hopefully the least amount of drum contact, right, possible. So does that make sense? So that is like, I wouldn't see like more RPMs as more convection. It's more like there's the sweet spot, and then on either side of the sweet spot you get less. So. Mm-hmm.
Are these, environmental temperature or bean temperature?
Generally, I'm focusing on bean temperature. I don't think. Okay, so I should address this more in classes. Both matter. I tend to focus on bean temperature more, partly because people's ET probes are in all different places, and so what those numbers mean can be quite different. If it's in the front, if it's in the back, that kind of thing. And most people also kind of reliably have a relatively good quality bean probe, whereas some of the ET probes are like old and fat, or maybe in a strange location or whatever. So I feel more comfortable that the average roaster's bean temperature is a number I can relate to more. I would say, though, that both matter. And what you might want to do if you want to take it to the next level is look at the bean temperature and the environmental temperature. And a couple things are going to come out of that. One is that if you always say charge when you were roughly at, say, like 400 bean, 420 environment or something like that, that'll give you a little bit more accuracy than just focusing on the bean. The other thing that's interesting is that probably some of you have noticed this before, that if you, early in the roast day, if you haven't warmed up the machine completely adequately, the spread between the BT and the ET when the machine's empty is a little higher. And later, as the roaster gets hotter and hotter, the spread shrinks, right? To me, if that's happening to you, it's telling you didn't warm up the machine enough before the early batches. So you can use, I can't tell you what the spread should be. There is no standard. And it depends on what your gas setting is, et cetera. But if you can figure out how to get sort of the same spread under the same conditions early in the day as you can late in the day, then you've proven to yourself that you've stabilized the machine's thermal energy more successfully. Does that make sense? Okay. How are we doing on the camera? Now I'm completely paranoid. This is exactly why I lost tons of sleep the last few days. I'm like, tech. Yes?
I have one more question. So when you charge your drum, are you doing like a soak until you get to your turning point and then you're hitting the gas?
We will talk about the soak later. Yeah. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So, okay. So where should your probes be? Which side of the machine, left or right? It depends on whether your machine is clockwise or counterclockwise. In this case, this drum is spinning anti-clockwise or counterclockwise. And so someplace like this X is pretty reasonable for the BT. I would say if this is a clock face, on average you want to be about 4 o'clock or about 8 o'clock, depending on which side you're on. There's flexibility here, okay? What matters is this. What matters is that it's not up here or up here like some earlier machines had their probes. And it probably shouldn't be somewhere like up here, because On most batches, the probe might be in the beans, but on smaller batches, it might not be. So I think the smartest place to put a bean probe is where can you put it such that on your smallest batch, it's still immersed in the bean pile. Because it doesn't make a lot of sense if it's up here, and this means that every time you go below a half batch, that the probe isn't really in the beans anymore. So generally speaking, if the probe is about 2 to 3 centimeters from the faceplate, 2 to 3 centimeters from the inner drum edge on smaller machines, maybe add an extra centimeter on large machines, like let's say larger than 30 kilo, that's pretty good in the sense that you don't want to be too close to the metal, because the faceplate is not going to be as hot as the air in the drum most of the time. You don't want that to overly influence the bean probe tip. So that's like a good general recommendation. The good news is that when I started teaching these classes, most probes were up in this zone, and over the years, frankly, partly due to my badgering and partly due to just more awareness of data quality and stuff like that, the manufacturers sort of did this little trip where the probes kind of came this way, and now almost everybody's putting their probe kind of here or here. So there's very few machines now where they're not putting the probe in a reasonable location. The ET probe, we've talked about how they're all over the place. Sometimes they're up in the neck of the loading funnel. Sometimes I'll put them in place of that bolt on the loading funnel, but usually the one that's kind of opposite from where the beam probe is. Sometimes it's an exhaust probe, meaning it's in the back, close to the fan. All of them are fine. None of them are wrong. Their curves will look slightly different depending on which location you're in, and that's okay. All right. Any questions on probe location? Okay. This matters. Yep.
Best size for the probe.
We will talk about that, but generally speaking, I think if you're somewhere like in diameter, if you're about 2.5 to 4 millimeters, you're in really good shape. If it's really thin, it'll pick up more noise and it'll kind of flatten your very late ROR. And if it's really thick, you just have slow, sluggish data, and that's not very useful. So, but I think that's the happy medium is usually about 2.5 to 4 millimeters. So, okay. Alrighty. I'm just going to go through this really quick. This is just for curiosity. These are curves that came from the same exact batch of coffee, 2 probes right next to each other. And you can see how the thinner probe, they're both pretty thin. The thinner probe turns much lower and much sooner. This is significant because even this morning on the Facebook group, like people are always asking about where the turn should be and where the peak ROR should be. And the answer is that this is all fake data. This is not real. Like the turn is not real. Your beans are basically starting at room temperature and getting much hotter very quickly, right? They're never cooling. So this is just the probe has its own thermal mass. The probe is hot before you put the beans in, and it's taking time for the probe to shed heat. And then eventually the probe has cooled off to roughly the bean temperature, and now it starts to track the bean temperature with some degree of accuracy, and then it gets more accurate as it goes. So this is just my way of saying, don't worry about the turn, don't worry about the peak ROR. They are not real. They're completely fake data. Now, I will agree, if anybody asks, like your turn should be the same every time, right? If you roast the same coffee and over, if you're doing a good job with your between batch protocol, your turn should trace every single time. Okay, that just tells you that you've kind of gone through the routine properly with your thermal energy. But if you come to me and you say, my turn was at 150 degrees at 1 minute, and this turn was 170 degrees at a minute 20, I have no idea what that means in terms of flavor or roast development. Like, there's no way to know. It's mostly due to the probe itself doing those things, okay? Batch size matters, et cetera, but it's just important to not think that there's some correlation between peak ROR and flavor or anything like that, okay?
Are you logging every 30 seconds usually then?
Usually I'm logging every 10 or 15 seconds, but yeah. But why was this?
No, I was just
Okay. To be honest, like when I put up curves, I'm almost never paying attention to the units either, because it's like half of what I have is Celsius, half is Fahrenheit, some of it's on 15, some of it's on 30, and what matters to me is the principle, the shave. Yeah. Okay. So another discussion of probe location, and we're about to look at this machine has this. I kind of got the client to put a 3 millimeter probe. Unfortunately, put it there, which wasn't really where I wanted it, but it's okay. The original probe was 10 millimeters diameter. It's a 60 kilo probot, and this is what you get. Which that orange ROR curve is. Think about it. The peak ROR in reality happens about 1 second after you put the beans in the machine, right? The ROR is somewhere up here in the stratosphere, and then it comes down rapidly, right? His ROR peaked because of the math and the sluggishness of the probe. It peaked at about 7 minutes. So this is garbage data, right? And every one of the 10 millimeter ROR curves looked relatively smooth, very low, flat. Like it wasn't helping at all. So there was sort of a false sense of everything's going well with the roasts and everything's replicating well and all that. But it's mostly because the data is so smooth and so slow. The 3 millimeter probe showed that there was something really interesting happening in this particular curve, and it helped a lot to be able to see that and address it. So anyway, point is that there's still a handful of older machines out there that have really small probes. Most of the manufacturers are putting reasonable probe sizes in now. That took a while to get them to do that, but if you've got a 3-ish millimeter probe, your data quality is pretty good. Like it really helps having a good view of what's going on with your roasts. Cam, will you keep an eye on the phone battery? So I think at some point, if it, there may be a chance that I have to put that wireless charger back on, even though it heated the phone a bit later. Okay, when we take a break, maybe we'll do that. Thank you. Okay, so just to recap, sort of the best practices for probe, being around 3 millimeters diameter is reasonable. Ungrounded probes, Cropster recommends ungrounded probes. Grounded probes can work. Like most Diedrichs come with grounded probes. It's just that if you install a grounded probe, you run a risk of something called a ground loop, which at an extreme could damage your laptop or something like that. But basically, ungrounded JRK or an RTD is fine. Getting the probe tip, say 3 centimeters from the faceplate, 3 centimeters from the drum edge is great. A little bit more if it's a bigger machine. These are all pretty reasonable places to be. Okay, so going back to the things we talked about with the roast defect kit, there's underdeveloped, baked, and roastiness. I think that it's reasonable to focus on these as roast defects. I think if we try to focus on any other roast defects, it gets a little complicated. Because like we talked about, there's effects in your cup from green, there's effects in your cup from roasting. I think that green coffee scoring is relatively objective, right? I mean, if we taste the same green, we're probably going to be within a point or a half point of each other, and how we score it, like that's a pretty good system. Roast scoring is a nightmare. It almost doesn't exist, and people are roasting all the time, like having mostly baked roasts, but not necessarily aware of it or something like that. Like there isn't really a codified system for that yet. So I'd propose that we stick to something relatively simple as a way of sort of grading our roasts, like how was development, how was the baking, was there unnecessary roastiness due to conduction or flicking and things like that. But I think if you go past that, it's going to get a little complicated. And it'd be amazing if people were just even focused on these things with roast defects. So when we're talking about underdevelopment, we're mostly talking about not cooking the bean centers enough. So in other words, not making the cellulose in the center of the bean brittle enough and porous enough. What this will do to your coffee, it'll make your coffee kind of vegetal. It might make it extract less if the underdeveloped is extreme. Might come out kind of grassy. You'll notice with really undeveloped coffee, if you try to crack it with your nail or with your tooth, that it's really tough. It's more rubbery. It's less brittle. The causes of underdevelopment can be many. Cold beans won't necessarily cause underdevelopment, but it is harder to develop the center of really cold beans. Roaster not warmed up also wouldn't necessarily cause underdevelopment, but you'll see more often than not if you don't warm up the machine appropriately before the first batch, you have a better chance that you're going to have underdevelopment in your first batch. If you roast extremely fast, when I say this, I'm talking about relative to your machine and a certain batch size. In other words, if you put 20 pounds into a 12 kilo Probot and you roast it in 6.5 minutes, I'm sure that's too fast and you won't develop well. But if you put 6 pounds in that same machine and roast it in 6 minutes, you probably got good development, or at least you could. So it depends on the machine, depends on the batch size, but the point is don't roast too fast relative to your situation. Okay. And if you kind of sag your way into first crack with a very low ROR, you also might end up having a little bit less development. So for instance, when we do the roast defect kit, we tend to cut the gas a little bit too much too early so that the ROR kind of slumps into first crack, and that almost always reliably leads to lower development. Okay. Yes?
What is considered a very low ROR?
So there is no number. I can't prescribe a number because it depends on your batch size, how fast you're roasting, and how big your probe is. So and then not even getting into the idea that you might be on a 15-second ROR, somebody else might be on a 30, and someone else is on Celsius and you're on Fahrenheit. Like it gets messy, right? But if you see, let's just take your own roasts, for example. If you're doing, hundreds of roasts, and you're typically at something like, say, 20 degrees Fahrenheit per minute going into first crack, and maybe you have a coffee where you kind of slump down to, say, 15 or 16, like you might be a little more worried about development in that situation. I can't prescribe what's right for you. And if you're...
That worked out very well, actually.
Okay, yeah. I mean, and also, if you're roasting in 13 minutes, someone else is roasting in 10 minutes, all else being equal, your ROR is always going to be lower. Yeah.
Does that sometimes cause, because you kind of overheat it too fast and then you're throttling back and then it slumps? Or?
Could be a lot of things, sure. Mostly, I think on average, it's just decreasing the gas a little bit too much too soon and just realizing, it's pretty hard to put that gas back, basically. And it's like by the time it happens, you're like, oh, shoot, I'm sagging. And then you've got to hope that just going longer is going to make up for it, but, may not. So.
For those of us roasting on the Artisan
Yeah.
program, their ROR is on a 60-second base. Is Cropster also on 60? Or?
So Artisan gives you the choice of any number of seconds from 1 to 60. Okay, and also Artisan, you can choose the degree of smoothing. Cropster doesn't let you choose your smoothing. It does let you choose like 10 second, 15 second, 30, or 60, so it's like a multiple choice of the ROR level. Even if you choose 15 seconds of Cropster and 15 seconds in Artisan, they won't look the same because they're actually using different algorithms to kind of process and smooth your data. So it's actually really hard to get the Artisan data and the Cropster data to look identical. And also, I mean, it even sometimes depends on which computer operating system you have when you're working with Artisan. Cropster is a little more plug and play in the sense that you can pretty much attach Cropster to any system, any laptop, and you're going to get the same result, whereas with Artisan, you have to tweak the back end more to kind of find the settings that work. So, yeah. Okay. Because your probe is only reading surface temperatures, you can't know what's going on in the center of the bean. So you can't just look at a curve and say, that was underdeveloped. There's just no way to be 100% sure. For your own coffee, you might have a sense, like I was talking about the slumping ROR, you might be like, oh, this one's slumped, I bet development could be a little lower. But you with baking, you could look at a curve and say, oh, that turned down really hard, that was baked. With underdevelopment, you can't really be sure. So just FYI, like looking at curves, you can tell a lot of things, but you can't really tell development level. So baked, we're talking about a drastic drop in the ROR. So the ROR is kind of going along, and then suddenly, we've all seen this before. It's fun. There's certain coffees that give you fits when you try to fix this. It definitely takes away sweetness and roundness and juiciness. It tends to impart a little bit of like a flat or cardboard or straw flavor onto the coffee. There's people who believe that the ROR crash is fake. It's just an artifact of something to do with moisture release and the probe that has nothing to do with flavor in the cup. I think that's absurd. And I think that anybody who honestly blindly cups and is pretty good at controlling roasts and getting some really smooth curves and some crashed curves, if you do it enough times, you have to eventually realize that the harder the crash, the more sweetness you've lost. I think based on my Instagram, I get a lot of random unsolicited messages. I'm not just talking about the ones where people tell me I'm a jerk. That's different. But people send me their roast curves all the time, and I don't even know who these people are. But it's interesting. They're always like, "Oh, Scott Ray would be proud of this roast curve," and I look at it, and it usually looks something like this. I'm like, "Why? What did I say that made them think this is what I want?" So I do think there's a little bit of a disconnect that what I think of as a smooth ROR and what someone else thinks may not be the same thing. I don't think we're all speaking the same language. So I think that a lot of people are used to they're just happy that the ROR is never going up, that it's always going down, and that's kind of good enough, so they think like, oh, I must not be baking or something like that. So I think we have a long way to go in terms of interpreting the curves and speaking the same language. So these next few curves came from a job I did where these folks had a Diedrich. They tended to put too much coffee in the machine. They tended to take a long, this is like a 16.5-minute roast. And all of their curves looked exactly like this. It was like a super long flat section and then a huge crash. This came partly from stuffing the machine with too much coffee and partly from using too much gas going into first crack, because they were keeping the gas super high because they were using too much coffee, and they were eventually trapping too much heat, and then by the time they lowered the gas, it was kind of too late. So their coffee tasted really baked. So when I got there, I said, look, just roast the batch. I'm not going to say a word. Just do your thing. And this is exactly what they got. And then on the very next batch, so I said, okay, use more gas at charge, and for the first half of the roast, drop your gas more around first crack. And we got this. That was better. like definitely a huge step in the right direction. Still baked, still not good. The next roast, the good news is with the baking went away. We did the same thing. Even more gas in the beginning, less gas in the second half of the roast. It smoothed it out, but we got a bit of a stall. We got this sort of, which can make coffee kind of taste like, kind of, yeah.
Is this in the PowerPoint presentation that you sent?
Yes,
us?
yes.
Okay.
That stall's not good for development, and also kind of makes coffee taste a little granular, like a kind of edgy. It's hard to describe. But so anyway, not a great roast. But the good news was that the round, juicy, fruity character was there in a way it had never been in one of the roasts before. So we actually stopped here and we went and we cupped the coffees just to kind of get to some agreement about the baking and stuff. And it was great because they when they tasted this one, we did it blindly. They were like, "Ooh, this is very different than anything we've done before," and that was really good to get the buy-in from them on that. So anyway, step one usually, if you see something like this, is try to use more gas early, less gas late, as a ballpark thing, just to kind of smooth it out a bit. Obviously, even when you get to here, you have a lot of work to do, but just to eliminate the crash. Okay, so extra roastiness. This can come from the drum getting too hot, too much conduction. Yes?
Real quick, as far as bake goes, something you touched on recently on one of your Instagram posts was the last like 20 seconds of a roast, not letting the ROR dip below like 1 or something like that.
Okay.
Because you said it because of the 10-second buffer or whatever.
Okay, but that has nothing to do with baking.
Okay.
Okay.
But could you touch on what it does have to do with?
Sure, sure. All I was talking about, so in and of itself, hitting 0 is not necessarily, there's no associated flavor taint as far as I'm concerned. Now, if you're always going to 0 at the end of a roast, you have two problems. One is that you might not be developing coffee as much as you could because you aren't getting much development out of a coffee that isn't really getting hotter. And number two is that there's going to be some roasts where you're going to stall before you are done, which is not good. So avoiding 0 is smart for those two reasons, but that doesn't mean that hitting 0 is going to impart a taste defect, right? Like there used to be a belief that if you went under a certain amount, whatever, everybody thought was a different amount, that caused baking. It's just not true. And the belief has kind of dissipated over the years. So my point about that was on the post was that Cropster or Artisan are averaging your readings over X number of seconds. So let's say you're averaging over 15 seconds. If you come quickly down to 0, your actual real-time ROR, those last 5 or 10 seconds, is negative in order to average over the course of 15 seconds and come to an average of 0. Right? If you've got some positives, you need some negatives. So my point there was just, if you're hitting 0, especially if you're getting there quickly, you are in negative territory, which is not good. Stay in negative long enough, you get like a papery, weird flavor in your coffee. So anyways, that makes sense. That was really the, it'd be just a smart plan to try to avoid going to 0. Yeah. Just makes life easier more often, So extra roastiness. This isn't about how dark are you roasting the coffee. This is about unnecessary roastiness. In other words, you could roast really dark, keep your ROR smooth, and get a nice sort of heavy caramelly cup without a lot of edgy bitterness. Or you could roast pretty light, have a huge flick in the ROR like this, and even though it's a light roast, it might taste really kind of bitter and a little bit roasty. So that's what I'm talking about here is if the ROR goes up or the drum gets way too hot, you're going to char the flavor in some way. It doesn't necessarily mean the coffee is dark. Okay.
Is this where we get tipping from?
Yes and no. This definitely wouldn't help. Tipping is mostly coming from drum contact.
Conductive energy.
Mostly, right. Think about this though. If you're outside in the winter and your face is exposed or your hands are exposed, you have so much more surface area relative to volume, say in your fingers or your nose, than say in your cheek or your arm, right? And so they feel colder. There's also circulation issues and all that, but the idea is that if it's got more surface area relative to volume, you're gonna have a little bit more sensation of the hot or the cold or whatever is attacking it, right? If you have a pointy bean or such, like most beans have a little bit of a pointy end, right, to some degree, like there's a little bit more damage that's going to happen there than say at like the smoother belly of the bean. Right, and so some of that doesn't have to always be from conduction, but some of that is going to come from just the extra heat transfer relative to the surface area.
I see it happening mostly with Brazils, and is that sometimes just because of the coffee itself?
Yeah, so certainly softer beans are a little more prone to surface damage than harder beans, and Brazils tend to be pretty soft. So could be a lot of things, but yeah. I mean, bottom line is that if your RPM is reasonable, your airflow is reasonable, your roast time is reasonable, and you're not flicking, or the ROR is never going up, I should say, you probably have done almost everything you can to avoid tipping, and there still might be some tipping in some coffees, and you're probably not going to be able to avoid it completely. So, remind me what kind of machine you have?
I have a Buckeye.
Oh, okay. Those are rare. Yeah, so in a situation like that, you might get a little tipping in all your Brazils. You're not going to be able to completely eradicate it. Sorry. Yeah, you can stop buying Brazils, and I guess that'll fix the problem. But I don't know. So, any thoughts, comments on flicks, roastiness?
Just the amount of airflow going through the machine after first crack to kind of clear out some of what's going on from
Yep.
the roast development. Does that help reduce roastiness, or can it
No,
cause
I don't think so.
So you're just on that side of the fence, 100%.
I mean, let's face it though. When you are talking about potentially like adding airflow or something like that, how do you know I'm not already at that level of airflow? Like, there's no, like, this is sort of like the increasing the RPM to increase convection question. It's like, I think that if you're already at the sort of right amount of airflow, like we were working on earlier, there's no benefit to raising it at that point. Now,
Clear out anything that might just
well,
soak in the bean.
if your flame is pulling at 80 degrees into the trier, let's say, I don't think you're going to end up with any chaff stuck to the beans or anything like that. I think you've got enough airflow to clear it out in almost every machine. So hopefully that level of airflow is the solution to, it's going to help with ROR crashing. It's going to help with smoke removal. It's going to help with chaff removal. Like, it's going to be adequate for all of those things. You don't want to just use extra airflow unnecessarily, because now you're sucking heat out of the system faster, and the only way to fix that is to use more flame, which makes the drum a little hotter, which is not necessarily a good thing. Okay. The only
That flick from happening and get enough development to satisfy the client.
increasing your airflow is definitely not going to fix your flick, unless you were truly not using enough airflow for the whole time. Okay. Fixing the flick is going to have a lot more to do with avoiding crashing, and then also the timing of your gas changes after first crack, which is the end of the presentation. So we will get there. But I will promise you, because you're a really good student, I promise you that if you really religiously follow what we talk about at the end, you're never going to flick anymore. And I mean never. Like, maybe the first time you roast a coffee, you'll have a surprise flick, but then you'll be able to prevent it all the time. So, yeah. Okay. Okay. So, let's see. We'll do let me just do a couple more slides and we'll take a break. Okay. So, we all think a lot about quality, but I think that, quality without consistency is not okay, in the sense that, I think that's where almost all of us are at, is that most pretty good roasters have some really good batches, and then if they're being honest, they have a lot of inconsistency, a lot of curves that don't track, a lot of coffees that just are tasting different batch to batch, a lot of times where you have that one batch, you're like, that was amazing, and then you just can't replicate it, right? So I got to be honest, like, for all the people that I've worked with, I don't think prior to work with something that anyone ever actually touched upon all the basic tools to increase their chances of consistent roasting. In other words, this list is very powerful, and almost nobody is following the list. The few people I know who follow all of this, actually, they trace curves like you wouldn't believe. Like, they almost never don't trace. It's awesome. Green storage temperature, basically, just decide for the rest of your life that your green is going into the machine at one temperature, and it never changes. Yes, Elliot?
Would you recommend a good temperature to store your green at if
Well,
you're building a green?
we'll talk a little bit more about storage later, but basically, if you're concerned about longevity, store your beans really cold. The colder the better, right?
But if there was room to prepare for the next
Right.
roast.
So let's say you say, I'm willing to do anything. I'd say, great. So now you're keeping your long-term storage really, really cold. And then 3, 4, 5 days before you roast, you put the beans into a second room that's, say, 70 degrees or 21 Celsius, right? And then that's your staging room, right? So, like, I have a couple of really big clients who are like, hey, I don't want to heat a warehouse that's this massive, right? So they let the warehouse get really cold, and then they have a staging room that's like the size of a shipping container where they keep the next 4 or 5 days worth of beans.
60, 75 degrees for the staging room.
Yeah, room temperature, like comfortable room temperature is pretty reasonable. One nice thing about it is that it's a pretty easy temperature to hit, because you're already kind of there in hopefully in most of your roastery environment. But you know how it is. Like, if you let the roastery kind of fluctuate 10 degrees Fahrenheit, even 5 degrees Celsius, like, over time, like, you're going to notice a difference in the development and the roasting, and it's going to be frustrating. And Cropster can't help you with this, because you're only reading surface temperatures. You're not reading internal bean temperature. So the only way around that is just stabilize your whatever temperature you choose. If you choose 70 Fahrenheit, 21 Celsius, just choose it and live with it and just make it happen all the time. It's not that hard. And that just makes it so much easier. And I've had clients who really didn't want to do it, and then when they finally did it, like a month later, they called me. They're like, "This is so great." You know, like it's just one of those things. Like once you do it, you're like, "Okay, this is great. I've just ticked a huge box in terms of the struggle of trying to be consistent." You know, don't get me wrong. Like, you know, you're a good roaster. You could make smooth RORs all day long out of green of all different temperatures, but matching development is basically impossible.
For the last 2 months compared to
Yeah.
70 degrees in the
Yeah.
summertime.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay. Ambient roastery temperature, this is pretty tough. This is the one place where I kind of forgive people for letting it fluctuate a bit. If you have a big warehouse, it's pretty hard to keep the ambient temperature constant. That said, you know, do your best with it. I won't pick on you if you're not perfect with it, but you know, it definitely matters. You know, warm-up procedure and between batch protocol we'll talk about. Those are critical to replicating the machine's thermal energy over and over so that you get very consistent roasting. Having the proper probe size and location to be able to read your data well, of course, is critical. And you know, looking at your data through the right ROR interval and things like that is critical in the sense that if you're looking at a 60-second ROR interval, you have no idea what's going on with your roast in real time, right? Like you're fooling yourself. Everything is smooth. Everything looks great. It's like beer goggles for roast curves. It's just, you know. You're not being critical enough of your own coffee. You know, you should be looking at the 10 or 15 second view in Cropster. And if you're an artisan, you want to be able to, you know, use as little smoothing as possible so that you get lots of little noisy bumps in your curve, but not like seismograph, you know, up and down. Okay. So really, this might seem kind of boring, but this is like if you do all of these things, which none of it is expensive, none of it is difficult. None of it, you know, it doesn't even take that much time to do it. You've just made roasting 10 times easier than if you don't. It's just, it's so sensible. This is a starting point. This is not necessarily the exact recipe for anyone, but this is quite reasonable based on just using many machines and seeing what the sort of average or norm is amongst those machines. So looking at the bean temperature probe, we're looking at something like, you know, use medium to high gas. I see a lot of people like putting the burner on like 25% for their warm up or something like that. I think they're afraid of using too much gas. I'm really not sure why. The steel drum is going to be fine. Just crank the gas. Get yourself well above your charge temperature. Get yourself usually something like 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius above your charge temperature, and then idle there for a solid 20 minutes, maybe more in colder weather, and then come down somewhere just above charge for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then you want to